Okay, I'll go ahead and just get started here. Welcome everybody, and today I am with Elee Wood from the Huntington in Los Angeles. Elee, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background in education of, shall we say, collections professionals in the broadest sense.
Yeah. Okay. And just a quick correction: it's Elee. With got a smile when you say
Oh,
it.
I'm so sorry. So sorry.
Okay. So, wow. I just as a sort of a to get started, I started off my museum career as a youth volunteer at the Milwaukee Public Museum in the 20th century, and as I made my way through various processes, I found myself as a professor of museum studies at IUPUI, which is in Indiana, Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, with an emphasis on civic engagement in museums and focusing on how museums can become more specifically connected to communities. And so that really shaped a lot of my understanding of where and how and what museums can be. I grew up essentially in an old school diorama based place, but I have loved museums since I was a kid. I think that's why a lot of people get interested in museums, and one of the challenges that we have to continue to think about. And so moving forward into being a faculty member, I was drawing a lot on my prior experience working both as a young person in a museum, but also having worked as a staff member in public programs before I went off to graduate school and did all that. So as I went into this sort of new model, thinking about teaching people museum studies, was really drawing on the experience of how do we help other people experience museums in the way that we really like and care about. And that really kind of focused my thinking around what is my responsibility as an educator to support the practice of museums and the people of museums. So really thinking about the role that everyone has in relation to a collection, in relation to the experience, and how we're bringing all that together. So thinking about whether or not I'm an educator doesn't mean that I can't focus on collections. I focus on collections in a slightly different way than a collections care person might, or a registrar or a curator. And we're all coming at it in different directions. And so that was one of the things that was really important to me in thinking about this next generation in museum studies, was thinking about more holistically how we all come together around the same idea, or that core idea. So that sort of like shaped a lot of my thinking in the bigger picture, if that gets you where you want to go.
Yeah. And explain your role now at the Huntington.
So I made the leap. I went back into practice to actually preach what I professed, or practice what I professed. So I'm now the Director of Education and Public Programs, which is the major division within the Huntington that emphasizes on public engagement. We cover all areas from volunteers, school programs, gallery experiences, public programs, community engagement, and so forth. So we have a pretty strong role institutionally working with all of the collecting divisions and others to really activate the experience of the Huntington and help people make connections to our collections, and really working on, especially with, because we have a research library, how we are able to surface the stories that exist in the library collections, which are enormous and vast, but also in helping connect people to the botanical collections and the gardens and our art collection. So it's a very transdisciplinary, comprehensive way of thinking about the world, and it's been really interesting to make the shift from being a faculty member back into practice. I actually quite enjoy trying to make it all come together in the way that I had hoped my students would.
It's so interesting. God, I wish this was the live thing. I want to ask you so many questions, but we'll stick to the script.
Yep.
So in previous, historically, maybe historically is even too big of a term. What is the quote unquote traditional way that you've seen of teaching museum studies, and like, maybe a certain emphasis on X, Y, or Z, or explain kind of where we typically come from.
So what I would say is that I think most typically where early professional training programs were really focused very disciplinarily in terms of you're going to learn how to do curatorial practice, but maybe you don't even talk about what curatorial practice is. You're just becoming expert and depth in your field. You might be studying collections care and management, for example, that was really the focus of your work, or you might just be doing education. And one of the things that I think, so it was sort of like very specific to the role within the museum. So you wouldn't cross the streams, or like you're only a collections person, you're only education, you're only curatorial. And I think that one of the things that I really liked about the program that we developed at IUPUI was that it was very much that, yes, you can be a collections person, but you have to understand why education matters. And if you're an educator, you have to understand why collections matters, and why you can't just let everybody sort of play with all the stuff all the time. To really kind of bring a different perspective that this is a whole institution that has many parts, and that you have to understand how it all works together. That I think becomes a more valuable way of working together around, like we're all in this towards a mission of an institution, and that mission may have many different pathways, but we're all part of that same idea. So that I think is really kind of something that was important to me. And and there's still programs out there that are very much focused on just being a curator, or just doing collections, or any of those kinds of things. And I think that the nuance that it brings actually helps for a lot more collaborative work internally, as much as it does kinds of planning and how we're able to tackle challenges that come up in different ways.
So good. I mean, so what I want to do next is I want to get your perspective on some of the key changes that are taking place, and then follow that up with what, if you think that these changes are being reflected in newer curriculum that are being developed.
There's no question that some of the major areas of change that are happening are really understanding the nuances of audiences and the importance of institutions being able to understand themselves as entities in a cultural environment. So I'm talking a lot about understanding diversity, access, inclusion, accessibility, all of those kinds of things, but not just from the audience standpoint, but also from the kinds of collections, the collecting that we do, the practices that we follow, the meaning that objects have that can be different across different types of audiences. And I think that shift is really critical in helping us be able to become more relevant for communities. And that is part of our survival. So I think it's all kind of interconnected around, as Stephen Weil says, being about somebody rather than something, that we're really trying to really understand how and why the kinds of collections we have matter to different types of groups of people. So I think decolonization and decolonizing the collection is a really good example of paying attention to what is there. Why do we have it? What is it here for? How can we better use it? How do we care for it? Does it belong to us? Should it belong to someone else? Like, I think those kinds of questions are pretty key, and they cut across all the institution. Thinking about how we're representing objects, or how we're telling stories about the collections, how we're pulling out different stories that have not been told before. I think all of those kinds of things are really, that is sort of at the core of everything, but it can even go down to how we take care of objects, and thinking about culturally relevant practices around managing collections, for example. They're, taking care of Indigenous collections has a lot of variation that sometimes kind of fly in the face of what you learned in school. That you're not supposed to let something have light, but there are certain types of native objects that need care and feeding in a very, very different way that might make you feel a little bit like, but that's not best practice. But I think the question is, going back to that, what does best practice mean is really about what's good work around doing the best by all the people involved or all of the needs that are there. It's not just a one step, this is the only way to do it. So that sort of expanding ways of knowing about how we deal with material objects, concepts, people, all of those kinds of things I think are really at that core of where we need to be shifting towards, and has been for the last probably 5 years for sure.
So you're saying there's already been a shift that's been initiated, say in the last 5 years, and I guess you've pointed out some of the critical issues: decolonization, DEIA, but how is the pandemic changing that, and do you see further changes as a result of the pandemic? Changes to the curriculum?
So there's good, bad, and ugly, I think, in thinking about the effects of the pandemic. And the ugly is that realization of sustainability of institutional just livelihood. So the number of museums that closed, the number of staff that were laid off, and sort of all of those changes, I think, were one big reality check for our practice. And so benefits of different organizations, different sizes and funding streams, all of that has a lot to do with sort of the effects that the pandemic really kind of came through. And I think what happened was that it exposed cracks in various systems, and then it sort of blew some of them open, and others changing the way to think about things. So if you think, I think about how challenging work in the pandemic was if you work in collections, that you have to be in a place with stuff. You can't take care of something from a distance. So the sort of being in person became a big issue, and we had to deal with that here institutionally in terms of defending people coming in as essential in terms of taking care of collections, especially living collections. There's a big difference there, but also just sort of maintaining and thinking about how we can change what we do, how we better understand how computers can be useful for us, and thinking about how we share collections. So we, as being both research library but also a public institution, finding ways to support people being able to look at a document with a curator on the other end, or a reader services person, was something that sort of evolved. That now we know we can do it. We know that it's possible for people to not have to travel to look at something rare. I mean, obviously being in person with the real thing still matters. So finding out different ways to shift and solve those problems programmatically, obviously. We never thought we would be doing Zoom the way that we are. So I think that the pandemic gave an opportunity, and many institutions took this as a moment to make a shift, or to take something off the table that became obvious that it wasn't going to work anymore. And it gave us the permission to make a change that we needed to make. Sometimes it forced us into that, and that's okay too. But thinking about when you're sort of in a museum studies program, how do you do an internship remotely, and how does that change your experience? Thinking about all of the different practical ways of working, I think the pandemic has helped us really pay attention to what matters, what do we maybe not need to worry about as much, and where should we pay more attention that we hadn't realized before. I think that's sort of what I've seen, and obviously, it changes depending on the size of the institution and how affected you were, depending on, where you were at in the country or the world, and all of those kinds of things. But it's much more complicated, I think, than we realize.
Yeah, of course. Also related to the pandemic, there's been the so-called Great Resignation that's happened, dare I say, worldwide, not just in the United States. And the collections care community is no exception to this. We're talking about everyone from art handlers to registrars, conservators, etc. Right? So, how do we continue to attract people to the profession, and not only attract people in general, but to expand our audience to more diverse audiences, because that has also been a problem within our collections care community.
I think this goes back to what I had described before, that thinking about relevance and how museum practice creates a place where you see yourself reflected, you hear stories that you didn't expect of people you don't see every day in museums. It's not sort of the same story you've already heard it, you heard in school, etc. Being able to raise up those voices and give people the opportunity to see themselves reflected is among the most important strategies in terms of just getting someone to be interested in work in a museum. So if you think about, we used to joke during admissions time is that like the number one statement in everyone's personal essay was, "I've loved museums since I was a kid." So that may be true, but if you didn't go to museums as a kid, how do you get exposed to it? Where does that love for the past, or sort of the representations of the past, artwork, plants, animals, like whatever the collection might be, how do you get excited about that? And where's the entry? How do you get through the door? Sometimes it's just knowing that there is a job, that there are people who do those kinds of things, and being more transparent about the kind of work that goes on behind the scenes. We're actually just about to debut some videos from our conservation team around the kinds of work that they do, and that will be targeted at young people a little bit from a career standpoint, and thinking about how do we help people see all of the things that happen behind the scenes, but also then moving into the public eye some of the work that happens. So a lot of conservation projects in public, I think, have been very successful in helping people see what that work looks like. But for me, it really comes back to feeling like you belong in an institution, and that you have a role to play, and that is valued, really is part of that, how we help people feel connected. And some of that is clearly about the working conditions. So, do we pay people a living wage to be able to do this? Do people have the opportunity to work alongside of and be mentored by others who share similar backgrounds or experiences? How are we opening those doors? And there are a lot of different programs. We have an internship program that's supported in California, at least in Los Angeles, through the Getty, that is really targeted at the multicultural internship. So it's really targeted at underrepresented students who are interested in museum careers, to give them that opportunity and give a little bit more of a broader open door for more possibility for where you could go. And I think that's one of the challenges, is really just, did you have a chance to talk to somebody who helped show you this is how it works? When I was a youth volunteer, nobody told me that I could do this job. I was just there doing it, and I had this interest, but the door wasn't even open to me at that point, not intentional, but just sort of didn't think about the fact that that there are different career pathways that people are interested in. And I think, as you go farther and farther into understanding how museums work, you get to see more of the interesting parts: collections management, registration, conservation, preservation. All those kinds of things are really very magical. And you have to, we kind of have to pull the curtain back so that people can see it, to say, oh, that's what I really want to be able to do. How do I get there? And to help them figure out how to get there. I think those are the two parts of where where museum studies programs come into play, is really helping find that pathway.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. All right. And in conclusion, do you have any final thoughts or advice for upcoming professionals or people who might be interested in pursuing museum studies or arts administration?
Well, as everybody always says, do it because you love it, not because you're, fame and fortune are not necessarily hand in hand with museum work. But it's really about sort of finding that passion and satisfaction around making sure that people have access to ideas and things that matter to them, and their sort of sense of what it, like, all of us collectively need a place to go to think about what it means to be human. And that is particularly true as we continue to experience a lot of challenges in the world, whatever they might be, whether it's social justice or environment, politics, all of that, we need a place to be able to help us think about who we are, where we're going, what's possible. And that's what museums do. And so thinking about how you can contribute to that experience is what, to me, is why I would want someone to get involved. And whether that's this, like the smallest scale level of, cleaning textiles to really large scale, like refinishing or sort of doing work on a major work of art, all of that helps the end visitor experience the museum, but also the lasting legacy and all the ways that we help people connect to the world and to each other. That's kind of like, I think the primary thing has got to be that end goal, sort of following the mission and really working on a mission with a mission that you believe in. And that's where I think the Great Resignation has been interesting, is that people started to say, hey, you know what, this isn't actually what I really want. And I think at the end of the day, if you really focus on what you want, what matters to you, that's where you'll find yourself.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think it really has drawn a line in the sand, career-wise, and even within our institutions. The as you say, it's kind of blowing the cracks open. So super interesting time that we're living in, and I think there's a lot of opportunity sort of encased in there as well. So. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for your time and for contributing to this, and we hope you can contribute to ARCS in the future. Okay?
Great. Thanks for having me. It's been great.